Bryce Johnson is the data analyst on Expedition Bigfoot, the person whose job it is to process every piece of field evidence the investigation produces, and to build from that evidence the predictive model whose outputs have been guiding the investigation's deployment decisions across every season of the show's run. He does not break news. He processes it, which is why what he just broke about Expedition Bigfoot has produced the specific quality of stunned attention that his prior public communications about the investigation have never generated. Subscribe and stay until the very end. Bryce Johnson's contribution to Expedition Bigfoot has been the most consistently undervalued element of the show's production in the public conversation about what the investigation represents and what it has produced. The format that the show's broadcast presentation established for his role, the data analyst, the tech guy, the person who sits behind screens processing information that the field team generates while Ronnie LeBlanc and Dr. Maria Mayer are in the forest doing the physically dramatic work, is an accurate description of his operational function within the investigation, and a significant understatement of what that function actually means for the investigation's capability and for the quality of what the investigation produces. Bryce Johnson's academic background in data science and computational analysis gives the Expedition Bigfoot investigation something that no comparable cryptid investigation show has ever possessed: a rigorous, quantitative, methodologically defensible framework for processing field evidence whose application to the investigation's accumulated dataset produces outputs whose predictive accuracy has been one of the show's most consistently documented achievements. The predictive model he built and has been refining across the show's seasons is not a dramatic visual element whose broadcast presentation captures what makes it significant. It is a systematic analytical framework whose inputs are the full body of evidence the investigation generates: track evidence, acoustic recordings, thermal data, biological samples, witness accounts, structural evidence documentation, and the geographic and temporal distribution of all of it, and whose outputs are probability assessments, whose accuracy the subsequent field sessions have validated at a rate that the investigation's production record documents. When Bryce Johnson says the model points somewhere, the investigation goes there and finds something. That is not a television narrative device. It is a documented operational fact about the investigation's evidence-driven decision-making process. The specific credibility that track record gives his public communications about the investigation's findings is the foundation on which understanding why what he just broke as news is significant rests. He is not a presenter whose enthusiasm drives his claims. He is an analyst whose methodology has a documented accuracy record and whose public statements about the investigation's findings reflect the same standards of quantitative rigor that the model whose outputs those statements communicate demands. He just broke news. And what makes it news is what the model whose outputs he is now communicating publicly has produced about the nature of what the Expedition Bigfoot investigation has been finding. The predictive model Bryce Johnson developed for the Expedition Bigfoot investigation did not arrive at its current form in a single season. It is the product of progressive refinement across the full span of the show's production, an analytical framework whose inputs, whose weighting systems, and whose output formats have been developed iteratively in response to what the successive field seasons have produced, and what the model's prior predictions have established about the accuracy of its core assumptions. Understanding what the news Bryce Johnson just broke is about requires understanding what the model has been building, what the accumulation of evidence across every season of Expedition Bigfoot has produced in an analytical system whose entire purpose is to find the patterns in that evidence that the human investigators cannot find through direct observation alone. The first season's evidence contribution to the model established the baseline, the geographic distribution of documented activity across the investigation's first deployment areas, the acoustic signatures whose frequency analysis the model used to establish the species' vocal profile, the track evidence whose dimensional and anatomical characteristics the model incorporated into the physical profile database that subsequent seasons have been testing. The second season added temporal patterning, the specific timing relationships between evidence events within a single deployment that the model identified as non-random, and whose non-randomness established something about the behavioral organization of what the investigation was tracking. The third and subsequent seasons added the geographic and behavioral dimensions whose accumulation across multiple independent deployment areas in different regions allowed the model to begin distinguishing between the evidence of resident populations and the evidence of individual or temporary activity, a distinction whose specific significance for the investigation's population assessment the model's outputs have been progressively establishing. By the most recent season, the model had accumulated evidence inputs from enough independent geographic areas across enough temporal range to produce outputs whose character Bryce Johnson has described in the limited public references to the model's current state as different in kind, rather than in degree from what any prior season's evidence accumulation had permitted it to generate. The current model is not producing more refined versions of the predictions it has always produced. It is producing something different, a conclusion rather than a probability assessment, and the conclusion it has produced is what he just broke as news. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most recent field season produced an evidence contribution to Bryce Johnson's predictive model, whose specific character the model's analytical framework had not encountered in the prior season's evidence inputs in quite the same form or with quite the same convergent character. Multiple independent evidence categories producing findings whose correspondence to each other was not the approximate correspondence of independently generated evidence pointing in the same general direction, the kind of convergence the model had been documenting across prior seasons as its most significant outputs. The most recent season's evidence produced a correspondence whose precision the model's statistical framework characterized as beyond the coincidental overlap of independent evidence streams and consistent with a single underlying reality, whose multiple evidence expressions the investigation had documented simultaneously for the first time in the investigation's history. The acoustic evidence from the most recent season's primary deployment location produced frequency analysis results whose specific harmonic structure Bryce Johnson's model characterized as the most internally consistent vocal signature the investigation's acoustic record has ever captured. Not a single recording whose quality exceeded the prior record. A series of recordings from the same location across multiple sessions, whose consistency with each other established a stable vocal profile rather than the variable acoustic evidence that a population of multiple individuals producing independent vocalizations generates, the same source, repeatedly, in a pattern whose geographic and temporal distribution the model's analysis identified as consistent with territorial rather than transient behavior. The physical evidence from the same location produced the second convergent input. Track evidence whose dimensional profile across multiple independent impressions showed a consistency that the model's comparative analysis placed outside the normal variation range that a natural population of individuals produces. A consistency consistent with a single individual whose territory was centered on the investigation's primary deployment location, and the thermal evidence from the sessions at that location added the third convergent input, signatures at a specific position within the deployment area whose recurrence across independent sessions at predictable intervals. The model's temporal analysis characterized as consistent with a fixed denning or resting site, rather than the variable thermal evidence of a population moving through a territory. 3 independent evidence categories. 1 location, 1 individual, a fixed site. That convergence is what changed the model's output from a probability assessment to something more specific. The output that Bryce Johnson's predictive model has produced from the most recent season's evidence convergence is what the news he is breaking consists of, and it is an output whose character distinguishes it from every prior season's most significant model output in a specific way, whose understanding requires engaging with what the prior outputs looked like and how the current output differs from them. The prior season's most significant model outputs were probability assessments, quantitative characterizations of the likelihood that a specific geographic area contained a resident population of the unknown species the investigation has been tracking. The model expressed those assessments in the specific language of data analysis, probability percentages attached to geographic zones, confidence intervals whose widths reflected the evidence density available for each assessment, and directional predictions whose accuracy the subsequent field deployments tested against the actual evidence they produced. The model's deployment predictions across the prior seasons have been accurate enough that the show's production record constitutes a documented validation of the underlying analytical framework. The investigation has consistently found significant evidence in the locations the model identified as high probability, and has consistently found less significant evidence in the locations the model identified as lower probability. That predictive track record is the foundation on which the current output significance rests, because the current output is not a probability assessment. It is not an expression of the likelihood that something is present somewhere. It is a characterization of a specific location as the confirmed territory of a confirmed individual, a model output that moves from the probabilistic language of prediction into the specific language of documented fact. The model has enough evidence of sufficient consistency and sufficient convergence to characterize a specific location as the active territory of a specific individual of the unknown species whose existence the investigation has been building the evidence base to confirm. Not probably active, not likely inhabited, confirmed active. The model has enough evidence to say that something specific is in a specific place with a regularity and a consistency whose documentation across multiple independent evidence categories and multiple independent field sessions meets the analytical standard that Bryce Johnson's framework requires for the confirmed rather than the probable characterization. That is the output. That is the news, and what it means for everything the Expedition Bigfoot investigation has been building towards since the first season is what the remaining sections of this video establish completely. The Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant model output, the confirmed territory characterization whose existence and whose character Bryce Johnson's news establishes in the public record, is not in any broadcast episode. The information is in the production archive. The model's analytical output is documented in the investigation's internal record. The field evidence whose convergence produced the confirmed characterization is documented across the investigation's complete evidence record, whose existence the broadcast episodes have always implied without fully representing. Discovery Channel has had access to the information since the field season whose evidence produced the model's output was completed. Their editorial review of the investigation's findings from that season, whose most significant output is the confirmed territory characterization that Bryce Johnson's news is now communicating publicly for the first time, produced a response whose pattern is consistent with the prior history of the network's handling of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's most significant evidence. The confirmed territory characterization is not in the broadcast record of the season that produced it. What is in the broadcast record is a presentation of the season's evidence whose relationship to the complete record reflects the editorial management that the network's ongoing search commercial premise applies to findings whose character exceeds what the ongoing search format can accommodate without concluding the search. A confirmed territory characterization is not approach evidence. It is arrival evidence. The broadcast format can present approach evidence within the ongoing search framework whose commercial value to the network depends on the search's continuation. It cannot present arrival evidence within that framework without concluding the premise whose continuation the franchise's commercial value depends on. Discovery Channel's editorial decision about the confirmed territory characterization reflects that commercial calculation rather than any scientific uncertainty about the validity of the model's output. The output is valid. The evidence is real. The confirmation is in the model. What the network decided to do with that confirmation is what has kept it out of the broadcast record, and what Bryce Johnson's public communication is now changing. The specific implications of a confirmed territory characterization in the context of the Expedition Bigfoot investigation are what make Bryce Johnson's news the most significant communication the show has ever generated, and understanding those implications requires engaging with what a confirmed territory characterization means within the specific analytical framework that his model applies to the investigation's evidence. A territory is not simply a geographic area where evidence of a species has been found. It is a geographic area that an individual of that species uses in a specific and patterned way, returning to specific locations within it at predictable intervals for predictable purposes, maintaining consistent behavioral patterns across seasonal and temporal variation, and leaving the specific evidence signatures whose consistency over time is what the model's analytical framework requires, before it characterizes the territory as confirmed rather than probable. What a confirmed territory means for the investigation is what it means for any field biology investigation of a species whose geographic distribution and behavioral ecology a research program has been working to establish. It means the investigation now has a specific, documentable, returning subject in a specific, identifiable, predictable location. Not evidence that something was somewhere. Evidence that something is somewhere, returns there, and leaves consistent evidence of its presence whose pattern the model can predict with the analytical confidence that the confirmed rather than probable characterization requires. That is the specific operational change the confirmed territory characterization produces for the Expedition Bigfoot investigation. The investigation has been operating as a search across multiple potential territories, whose evidence profiles the model has been assessing for the highest probability deployments. The confirmed territory characterization ends that search phase and begins a different phase, the systematic documentation of a confirmed subject in a confirmed location. That transition from search to documentation, is what Bryce Johnson's news represents for the investigation's operational future. And it is what the broadcast format's ongoing search commercial premise cannot accommodate without transforming the show into something whose format the network has not been willing to support. Ronnie LeBlanc and Dr. Mireya Mayer's responses to the confirmed territory characterization that Bryce Johnson's model produced from the most recent season's evidence are the two most significant external validations of the model's output available, because their individual disciplinary frameworks are the most directly relevant to the assessment of what a confirmed territory characterization of this specific character means in the terms that their professional backgrounds provide. LeBlanc's response reflects his accumulated field research experience, whose depth and whose sustained focus on the Pacific Northwest environments where the investigation's most significant evidence has been concentrated gives him the specific comparative context for assessing what a confirmed territory characterization in those environments represents. His public communications about the most recent season's findings have been moving toward the confirmation that Bryce Johnson's news delivers without having previously stated it in the specific terms that the model's output now permits. What LeBlanc has communicated about the most recent season's evidence in the indirect terms his prior public communications have used reflects his awareness of the confirmation's existence combined with the specific professional restraint of someone who understands that the model's output needs to come from the model rather than from his field assessment of the evidence. He has been managing the distance between what he knows the evidence shows and what he has been able to say publicly about what it shows in the specific careful way that someone who understands the significance of the confirmation maintains that distance when the timing of its public delivery is not yet right. That distance has now closed with Bryce Johnson's public communication. Dr. Mireya Mayer's response reflects her primatology framework's assessment of what a confirmed territory characterization of an unknown large primate species represents in the terms that primate behavioral ecology applies to territorial confirmation evidence. Her academic background makes her the person whose professional assessment of the model's output carries the most specific scientific weight, and her response to the confirmed territory characterization, communicated in the limited terms her professional restraint permits, reflects an engagement with the model's output that treats it as scientifically significant rather than as an artifact of an enthusiastic data analysis framework whose rigor she might otherwise question. The Bigfoot research community's response to Bryce Johnson's public communication of the Expedition Bigfoot model's confirmed territory characterization is the external dimension of the news whose specific character communicates something about the significance of what the model's output establishes that the research community's own prior engagement with the investigation's evidence had not previously produced. The BFRO, the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization, whose database of systematic encounter documentation represents the most extensive prior evidence base for the species' geographic distribution, has engaged with the confirmed territory characterization in ways whose specific character reflects both the significance of what the model has produced and the specific professional dynamics of a research community whose relationship to the television production that generated the confirmation is complicated by the commercial and institutional distances between academic field research and broadcast documentary investigation. The academic institutions whose biological and anthropological disciplines are the most directly relevant to the scientific assessment of a confirmed territory characterization for an unknown large primate species in North American forest environments have not published responses. Their silence is the most significant element of the research community's response to Bryce Johnson's news, because it is the silence that the prior pattern of institutional engagement with significant Bigfoot evidence has always produced, not the silence of institutions that have assessed the evidence and found it inadequate, the silence of institutions that have not publicly engaged with the evidence because public engagement with a confirmed territory characterization for Bigfoot would require them to assess it against the scientific standards their disciplines apply to comparable evidence from known species, and because that assessment, if conducted honestly, would produce conclusions about the evidence's significance that the institutional culture of the relevant disciplines is not currently equipped to receive without the kind of fundamental framework revision that institutions do not undertake easily or quickly. The academic silence is itself a communication about the evidence's quality. Institutions dismiss evidence that fails to meet their standards. They ignore evidence whose quality requires them to reconsider those standards. Bryce Johnson built a predictive model and spent multiple seasons refining it against the evidence that the Expedition Bigfoot investigation produced. The model's outputs across those seasons have been accurate enough that their predictive track record constitutes the most rigorous ongoing validation of an analytical framework that any Bigfoot investigation has ever produced. What the model has now produced, And what Bryce Johnson has now broken as news is the output that the model's progressive refinement across every season of the investigation was always building toward. Not a more refined probability assessment, not a higher confidence interval around a geographic prediction, a confirmed territory characterization. The transition from probable to confirmed in the specific analytical language that his model applies to the investigation's evidence is the most significant single development in the Expedition Bigfoot investigation's history, and what its public communication changes about everything the investigation has built is what this final section of the video establishes. It changes the investigation's operational phase from search to documentation. The search for a high probability location is concluded. The documentation of a confirmed subject in a confirmed territory is what comes next. It changes the broadcast record's relationship to the complete investigation record. The confirmed territory characterization is in the model. It is not in any broadcast episode. The gap between those two facts is the gap between what the investigation has produced and what the audience has been shown, and Bryce Johnson's public communication of the model's output has made that gap impossible to maintain in the terms the network's ongoing search premise requires. It changes what the research community's engagement with the evidence requires. A confirmed territory characterization from a model whose predictive track record is documented constitutes the specific kind of evidence contribution that the relevant scientific disciplines cannot indefinitely ignore without the ignoring becoming a more significant institutional statement than the engagement would have been. And it changes what every prior season's evidence means in the context of the complete investigation record. The prior seasons were building the model's evidence base. The current model's output is what the building produced. Bryce Johnson spent every season of Expedition Bigfoot processing evidence whose accumulation was moving the model toward the output he just broke as news. The model arrived. The news is out. And what comes next for the investigation whose analytical foundation just produced the most significant output in the field's history is the chapter that the confirmed territory characterization has now made possible to write.